Good afternoon, everybody. At the outset, let me welcome you all on behalf of the Asiatic Society, which is the oldest center of learning and research, not only in our country, but in the continent of Asia, since it was founded by Sir William Jones in 1784. Sir William Jones by profession was basically a man of jurisprudence and came down to India as a judge of the Supreme Court, but he was equally identified as a pioneering and Indologist of British India. He was a polyglot by interest and was globally known for his intellectual achievements in many academic fields. The rich attainment of the tradition in Indological research that was set during the late 18th century was followed up first by a set of Western scholars, mostly European, then taken over gradually by the Indian scholars. Today's endowment lecture is in the name of Professor Panchanan Mitra, and this lecture was instituted by a generous fund provided by his family members since 1980. Dr. Panchanan Mitra was basically a man of English literature and then switched over to ancient Indian history and culture, and finally came down to the Department of Anthropology and eventually became his head. And in those days, they were brilliant scholars, versatile in all fields, not to speak of any specialization, but the discipline as a whole in anthropology. And he did his PhD in America under Clark Whistler, visited so many important prehistoric sites, published very important books, prehistoric archaeology, prehistoric India, and many others. And today our speaker for this endowment lecture is Dr. Anungla Aier. Anungla Aier is an anthropologist by profession who obtained her PhD from Northeastern Hill University, Shillong in 1995, and she served in Kohima Science College first as a teacher and then as a principal, and later on became director of the Women's Studies Center under Nagaland University. And she retired as the director of the Department of Higher Education, Government of Nagaland. She has, to her credit, a number of important papers and books. Her latest books, Studies in Naga Oral Tradition, Memories and Telling of Origin Myth and Migration, that was published in 2018. With this, may I request Dr. Anungla Aier to please deliver her lecture. Anungla Aier, please.
Hello from Nagaland and good afternoon to all. I'm immensely grateful to the Council of the Asiatic Society Kolkata and to the General Secretary, Dr. S.P. Chakrabarty, for conferring me with the award of the prestigious Dr. Panchanan Mitra Lectureship for 2019. I'm humbled by your kind gesture and I thank you, sir, for the recognition. Much as I would have loved to deliver this lecture in person, due to the COVID-19 pandemic that is affecting the entire world today, we will have to be content with only a recorded talk. And I'm hopeful that when the times are better, the opportunity will come for interacting in person. I'm very delighted for this opportunity, and in this talk I will be speaking about the Naga tribes of Nagaland. The Naga society basically is an oral society in the sense that although the written text has come to occupy a central space in all forms of communications, the cultural foundations of the Naga society and their sense of identity as a people is rooted in the tradition of folklore that has been transmitted generationally. And so for this talk, I have chosen to talk about folklore and identity assertion among the Nagas. With different tribes speaking different dialects of the Tibeto-Burman language, the Nagas distinguished among themselves as separate tribes, primarily on the basis of their distinctive dialect, their folk heroes, myths and legends of origin and migration, and other narratives such as stories of war, peace, and their cultural history. In reference to folklore and history, Jan Vansina, in the opening chapter of Oral Tradition and Historical Methodology, stated that oral traditions are historical sources of a special nature. Their special nature is derived from the fact that they are unwritten sources couched in a form suitable for oral transmission, and their preservation depends on the powers of the To the Nagas, their historical past is embedded in such oral tradition, and it serves as the foundation of their sense of identity. It is, however, pointed out that there are pertinent dangers in the usage of folklore and oral tradition as a source of history without proper verification, because the various genres of folklore are culture-specific categories, and notions of historical truth and untruth are notoriously vague within folklore. And locating historical facts within the myriad of other narratives is not an easy task. In oral societies, however, their ancestral past and history is preserved orally, as the art of writing was introduced much later, and like a jigsaw puzzle, we have to fit each piece of the oral narrative together till we arrive at a reasonable understanding to reconstruct the past. Myths of origin, folk heroes, and accounts of their exploits, and references to geographic markers and other such figures that finds mention in the folklore are important points of reference to garner collective cultural memories. Such figures and narratives pertains to what Jan Assmann calls figures of memories, which are fixed on certain fateful events of the past, and the memories of which are maintained through cultural formations such as rituals, monuments, songs and dances, and other such cultural items that maintain the narratives from generation to generation. As Asman pointed out, when such figures of memories are touched upon, such as when certain traditions are retold or enacted, they attain a kind of mnemonic energy that galvanizes the people to subscribe to having a shared identity and a collective experience. And the meanings of such figures of memories becomes accessible again across the millennia. The evidence from the Naga study also shows that the trajectory of the cultural past is drawn primarily by retrieving such figures of memories from the traditions that has been transmitted from one generation to the other. Normally, the accounts of such tradition begins with reference to ancestral settlements, thereby connecting their past with the present. In my studies on Naga origin and myths and migration, it has been found that though there exists shared myths of origin and legends of migration among a few tribes, there are always slight variations in the narratives among the tribes. Further, I have not come across a common narrative in folklore that explains the origin of all the 14 Naga tribes as a homogeneous group. This brings us to one of the most debated questions in the whole discourse on Naga identity. At one end of the discourse is the argument that the notion of a common identity is induced by political exigencies, while on the other, there is a general assertion that common identity as Naga is founded on common grounds of origin, myth, and migration. As a Naga myself, this has been one of the most perplexing questions that has driven my own research in the quest to understand the underlying cultural and historical foundations of Naga identity. As an oral society, all the different Naga communities draw their tribal identities on the basis of the oral tradition of origin, myths, and migration. And as far back as they can remember, those are the foundations of their identity as a people and the endorsement of the cultural practices, beliefs, and worldview. When we apply this understanding in respect of a particular tribe only, the tradition held by them renders a reasonable basis for the claims of a common origin and identity. However, when we try to apply the same reasoning for the claims of a common Naga identity based on oral traditions and folklore, we encounter a problem because it becomes increasingly visible that there is no single transcending tradition of common origin and memories of migration. For reasons such as this, some non-Naga scholars have rejected the idea of a common Naga identity based on folklore and oral tradition simply because there is no common origin myth, and that Naga identity is purely a political identity with no cultural foundations. Such conceptions, however, suffer from a preconceived notion that a common identity must be linked with the singular common myth of origin, and also that Naga assertion of common identity is politically driven. I, for myself, find no substance in this kind of conception, and I feel that the assumption that Naga oral tradition and folklore have been authored to fit into the rhetoric of Naga political movement as implied by those scholars has got no basis. Since the Naga assertion of identity is primarily based on folklore, the cultural analysis of their identity also requires a much more comprehensive approach, and it is necessary to explore the wider canvas of the folklore because what Hallowell said makes sense. He said that what people choose to talk about is always important for our understanding of their culture, and the narratives they choose to transmit from one generation to generation and to listen to over and over again can hardly be considered as unimportant in a fully rounded study of their culture. When in addition we discover that A certain class of these narratives may be viewed as true stories. This significance for factual behavior becomes apparent. For people act on the basis of what they believe to be true, not on what they think is mere fiction. For reasons such as this, it is important to explore the primordial consciousness and expressions of the folklore of the people that springs forth, binding the outwardly diverse so-called tribes under the banner of a common identity as Nagas. When we consider the oral tradition of the Nagas that talks about origin, it is interesting also to note that two divergent narratives exist side by side. One narrative pertains to autochthonous origins in and around the location of their present habitation, and the other narrative talks about the tradition of migrating from the east. Both the divergent narratives are not confined to a particular tribe, but we find that both types of narratives appears in the folklore of all the tribes. In the telling of these myths, we find some common elements, but no two myths are found to be exactly identical, and variations are seen even within a single tribe or a single village also. And very often we encounter multiple myths of origin and migration. And considering the multiplicity of myths of origin existing among the Naga tribes, it is crucial to remind ourselves that folklore, by its very nature, is dependent on the limitations of human memory, and there's always the element of forgetting and remembering at play. And ultimately, what we get is that we encounter many different versions of the same event. Further, one of the conspicuous characteristics of Naga myth of origin and migration is that it essentially talks about how a particular group of villages known today by a specific tribal identity, or a particular clan or a group of clans came into existence. Although different clans are known by different nomenclature in different tribes and assume different tribal identities, it is also to be noted that members of different clans who there are instances where members of different clans claims a common origin myth, and they tell of their clan dispersal to different directions and how they assume a different name. And therefore we find that although there may exist a common origin myth of a particular tribe, within it we also come across subsets of origin myths that tell about particular clans, which are not necessarily identical with the origin myths subscribed by their own tribe. An example of the situation is drawn here from the origin myth of Longtro, which is associated with the Ao tribe. Though this myth of origin is most deeply entrenched among the Ao, several northern Sangdam villages and some clans of the Chang tribe and the Pom tribe also subscribes to this origin myth, though the myth of Longtro is not projected generally as the origin myth of the Sangdam, the Chang, or the Pom tribe. Coming to the migration narratives, we often come across stories of various groups of people coming from different directions as in establishing new settlements. One such reference is clearly seen in the traditions that tell about Langa, an ancient abandoned village. There are several such settlement sites spread across the state of Nagaland, some of which remains as abandoned sites, while some have been continually occupied till. Among all the Naga tribes, it is quite common to encounter oral traditions of how bigger settlements were being regularly broken up for want of resources such as water, land for cultivation, and hunting grounds, or because of other warring villages, because of enemies. And people and small groups were constantly moving out and migrating and merging with other similar groups coming from other directions to form new settlements. Well, we also come across stories about how some groups of people were joining and merging with already established villages and assuming the identity of that particular adopted village. Each migrating group carries with them their own myths and stories of the past life that gets incorporated into the clan genealogy and folklore of the host village, or it goes on folklore of the new villages. In such a scenario, it is not surprising to find multiple myths of origin and migration. What we can take away from this is that perhaps the concept of tribe identity was much more fluid and malleable in the past, and the rigid tribe boundaries that we see in the present context was drawn less rigidly, if at all it existed. Another common characteristic seen in the origin myth of the Nagas, irrespective of tribe, is that originations imply an autochthonous origin, which took place in the ancestral village. In most origin myth, there is a claim of origination from objects of nature, such as stones as found among the Ao, some clan of the Sangdam, Chang, Pom, origin from particular trees, as in the case of certain clans of the Chang tribe, origin from the hornbill bird, as in the case of some Ao and eastern Sangdam clans. So in many cases, such origin myths are clan-specific, not tribe-specific. Another very common motif in the myth of autochthonous origin is the myth of origin from under the ground and coming out to the outside world through a hole or an opening on the ground. This particular mythic motif is in fact much more widespread than the myth of origin from objects of nature. Among the Ao Mongsan clans and then the Angami, references to origin from under the ground is mentioned in Chibi Mills 1926, the Ao Nagas, and Hutton's 1923, the Angami Nagas. However, during my fieldwork, I was not able to locate any living member of the Ao and the Angami community who could narrate this myth. And so I believe that, this myth appears to have been forgotten and lost among the Ao and then the Angami. But I was able to, document clear traditions of origination from under the ground among the Kemian, the Tikir, the Chang, the Sampor, Sangdam, Kunyak, Pom, Pochuri, and Lotha as well. The discourse on Naga identity perception clearly thus shows a strong element of myths of autochthonous origins indicating claims of indigenousness to the land and also frequent dispersal and merger among migrating groups. The other perception is the conviction of migration from the east, which is narrated with stories of how their ancestors have lived in faraway land with strange names that do not bear any resemblance with the conditions that exist in the present-day Nagaland or the nearby neighboring regions. For example, there are new of living besides very large expanse of water, experiences of flooding, stories of crossing large water bodies and dugout canoes, living in lands of extreme cold and high winds, such as in the story of Mitra. And alongside the widely spread myth of autochthonous origins and the migration from the east, we also find mention of encounters with forest people who were found living alone or in small groups in the forest, living a hunting-gathering subsistence. The reference to the encounters and coexistence with small pockets of groups of people subsisting on hunting and gathering and living in rock shelters, tree hollows, or caves, which are found, in the folklore of several Naga tribes, indeed raises great interest of anthropological and archaeological significance regarding the prehistory and peopling of the region. Though these narratives are not widespread, such legends about the forest or cave dwellers is likely telling about a group of ancient population living a hunting and gathering, existence, coming into contact with a rice-growing, migrating group from the east. Evidence from the folklore of the Nagas also suggests that rice production was preceded by a more ancient subsistence pattern that depended largely on viticulture and arboriculture. Some of the evidences of such subsistence pattern may be drawn from the ethnography of groups still in use, and also Sidhu grains, which are now abandoned but continues to be remembered in folklore as food sources. Though the folklore of the Nagas are replayed with detailed accounts of clan ancestors and their genealogy that spans over many generations, the many villages they established, reference to the idea in the term as Naga is not encountered in any of the myths and traditions pertaining to pre-colonial and ancient existence of the tribes. But on closer scrutiny of the Naga folklores, it is tangibly visible that the ancient villages consisted of people who had a shared past at one point of time, as seen in their clan genealogies and in their migration narratives. But the fact that each village existed as an independent entity coupled with practice of headhunting may have worked more towards creating ideal grounds for the diversification of language and development of specific cultural markers instead of bringing about a cohesive identity. Let me conclude by saying that yes, there are many unanswered questions rather than answers regarding ancient cultural history of the Nagas, and there is a huge field that is yet to be explored. Even the little documentation of folklore that I carried out have thrown up numerous questions, and it has also opened up new vista of information concerning the ancient cultural past. Though folkloric categories cannot be conclusive, and further rigorous inquiry of a multidisciplinary nature is necessary for further understanding, the studies on folklore points towards the existence of a shared collective past that existed among different tribes. It is on such ground of consciousness and history that contributed towards the development of the Naga cultural complex and the Pan-Naga identity. I have tried to, cover as much as I can within the limited time, but because of time constraint, I think I will have to stop here. And I'm hopeful that when the opportunity arises for more interaction, we can spend more time and go into more details about, what I have spoken today. So I'll sign off here. Thank you for letting me share my views and my opinions. Thank you.